Somebody asked me a question today in connection to this class of history, if this class really qualifies as a class of Torah. And I responded that there was a famous story of a king who had a philosopher who always instructed him in general abstract ideas. And of course, one of the things that he was always talking about was the divinity, God. At one point, the king asks the philosopher, "Can you give me a proof that there is a God in the world?" And the philosopher, who some say maybe Blaise Pascal, simply said to him, "Of course, Your Majesty, the Jews." Jewish history is a display, a demonstration of the hand of Hashem in history, the hand of Hashem next to the Jewish people. Just as we started, and you recall, just as we started our own history with the precise issue of Hashem taking us out of Egypt and being with us throughout our history, this is the greatest demonstration that there is a God in the world. And so, studying Jewish history, and today particularly, studying the rise of a Jewish state, something of that was inconceivable and perhaps even considered to be a mad idea, impossible idea, up to 1948. But people who did not believe that a Jewish state would be able to survive, even if it was there. And of course, even there are people today who probably dream that the Jewish people will be once again evicted from the land of Israel. Concept. I want to clarify that there are Jews who, or that there's a Jewish state, is in itself a demonstration of Hashem's greatness and his hand in history. You may recall, we will take it from where we left off. Herzl dies of a heart attack in 1904. And we recall that as he was planning and thinking about the political action in the world to bring about a recognition by the world that there should be a Jewish nation, a Jewish state, not just a little colony of Jews somewhere under somebody else's dominion, but rather a Jewish state in the form that Herzl presented it. This was the great contribution of Theodor Herzl. When he died, the concept of a Jewish state had become a reality, even though it was not yet in practice. But the concept, while the Herzl was talking about European governments supporting the concept and recognizing a Jewish state in Palestine, there was a great deal of diplomacy that was working, particularly in Europe. Herzl had left behind a whole group of people, particularly diplomats in England, who were very interested and understood the concept of being of a Jewish state. The remnants of Herzl are finally brought to Israel, flown to Israel, and buried in the famous Har Herzl in August 16, 1949. Herzl created the movement of Zionism that was, as he called it, a state on the way. And in reality, that movement that he started with such great efficiency, intelligence, and panache continues even after his death. The main successor of his effort were, of course, Max Nordau and a young chemist, Chaim Weizmann, who came from Russia, and he becomes the professor of chemistry in Manchester, and he is successful in inventing artificial acetone, the chief ingredient in cordite, which is the smokeless gunpowder. That was a very important part of the British war effort in the First World War, and for that he's going to be rewarded. In Israel, meanwhile, while the Zionists in Europe were trying to make the world recognize that Jewish state should rise, in Israel there were a lot of people who had come, as you remember, with the Biluim, the Bet Yaakov Lechu and Elcha, the people who said, let's go to Israel, not just talk about it. And they came and they started with these little colonies, Rosh Pina and Zichron Yaakov. And this is what we call, from 1882 and onward, the first Aliyah. But we recall that the first Aliyah had been less successful. The very small efforts in these colonies, the lack of economic success, made these colonies, almost some of them, fold out. And the concept idea of creating a new Jewish farmer, was actually become a dream that was no longer, did not become practical. But after the failed revolution in Russia in 1905, when there was a lot of pogroms in Russia again, and of course the famous pogrom of Kishinev, 1903. But after the October Revolution, the 1905 revolution, there are enormous pogroms as well. And this creates a great wave of immigration that we call it the second Aliyah. The second Aliyah is going to bring about a lot of young idealist Jews. This second Aliyah takes place from 1905 to the beginning of the First World War, 1914, and brought about 40,000 new immigrants, all of them emphasizing the concept of Chalutziyut. These people came in because they wanted to make a difference in the world. In fact, not only in the Jewish world, but in the world at large. Many of them were socialists, Marxists, people who had been at the forefront of the intellectual revolutions in Russia. And they come with a lot of illusions and a lot of ideas. We will see in a moment that because of the socialist ideas, many Arabs began to be very resentful of Jewish settlement because they thought that there were communists coming in. And people like Ben Tzvi, Ben Gurion, who, brought the idea of labor. They wanted to redeem the laborers of the world. And they thought that by creating a special labor society in Israel, they'll be able to set an example for the whole world. So it wasn't just the redemption of the Jewish people. They had a universal, almost messianic, secular messianic concept. And they wanted to leave the Judaism that was the Syrian Judaism, and that had sapped the capacity of the Jewish people to act. So they were doers, graders. It's interesting about the Russian literature. Tolstoy and others had actually extolled and praised the concept of the peasant. So these people wanted to create the Jewish peasant. In fact, they called it a religion of labor. Famous thinker called Aaron David Gordon. So we have these chalutzim coming and creating these communist cooperative colonies called the kibbutz, and they are contrasted with what were the old cities and old colonies that were essentially a capitalist groups. So there's going to be a tension between the capitalist cities like Petah Tikva, who are uncomfortable with the newcomers' radicalism, and these chalutzim. One of the biggest, if you ever remember the chalutz, the kibbutz, the equality of the sexes, the collective idea, there is one dining room, the children are all put together in one school, the kids don't
cannot
parents, all of these concepts.
Rabbi, I cannot hear you.
Can I hear me? I'm sorry. You cannot hear me at all? So we continue this concept of chalutziyut, the word to doers, collectivism. One of the famous school collective group was Degania. By 1914, there's 14 such kibbutzim. Um, Now, these kibbutzim are we're talking about how the beginning, we talked about in the last um, lectures about how the colonies started and they were plagued by malaria and other problems. Here we are going to begin to see something new: the rise of the Arab bandit, who is jealous, envious, and hateful of these chalutzim. Particularly, they did not like the women with shorts and the other elements of the Arab traditional society was baffled and by these people, and of course their socialist ideas. So there's a little bit of an enmity against these chalutzim, and the Arab bandits begin to raid and enter into these kibbutzim very often. So they begin to create a new society called the Hashomer, groups of people who are going to guard these settlements. One of the big groups there is done by Joseph Trumpeldor, who is a Russian Jew trained as a dentist. Actually, had been an officer in the Russian army, had lost an arm there, and he was, actually very important in creating a Jewish legion to help the war together with Jabotinsky. He creates called the Zion Mule Corps, a British battalion that was allowed to use the Magen David as an insignia. And Trumpeldor became a legend for his military service. And then he becomes the head of this group, the Hashomer. Eventually he goes to Tel Chai, the famous place that you visited, Tel Chai, one of the settlements in the Galilee, where Arabs at one point come in, and he, against the odds of a lot of Arabs who are coming to destroy the place, he continues to defend, and he's killed in the battle. He utters the famous words, "Tov lamut be'ad artzenu." It's good to die for our land, and you can see that monument in Tel Chai. But let me continue. We begin to see cities that are growing: Petach Tikva, Tel Aviv, the colony, the neighborhood outside of Jerusalem. They're beginning to rise. You remember that in the previous lecture we were talking about little colonies in the middle of a desert. Now these people are growing, and especially we're going to see a greater revival after the British come in 1917. But they're beginning to see there are 85,000 Jews in Palestine by the beginning of the First World War, 1914. The JNF is helping the settlers by buying land, and that's when, in 1909, they create Tel Aviv. Another thing that is very important in this development is so we have the movement of the Russian Jews coming in with these great ideas. The Jewish organizations creating funds, the Keren Kayemet LeIsrael, you remember those blue boxes, to buy land from the Arabs. And the third element, you have people creating new towns, Tel Aviv being the first and most brilliant example of industry. One more thing, which is very important, and that is the revival of the Hebrew language. A Jewish people coming to the land of Israel, speaking German, did not make any sense, or Yiddish, or Ladino. And so there was one man who was really like a madman, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who had been trained as a doctor in the Sorbonne. And as a result of his reading the novel Daniel de Ronda by George Eliot, becomes inspired to move to Israel. And moves to Israel, and he realizes that the Jewish people have to speak the Jewish language, and that's Hebrew. He creates an entire culture. He will only speak Hebrew. One of the memoirs of one of his children talks about how difficult it was. They didn't even know. There were words that didn't exist. He created many words. In 1904, he helped by some millionaires publishes the first volume of his dictionary. People thought that he was crazy. in 1904. Who spoke Hebrew? But by 1922, when he died, 30,000 people escort him to his grave, showing the great progress that had happened in the country. So we have here a physical creation of lands, of redemption of land, the creation of armies to protect them, the industry of people creating new places, and you have also the revival of the Hebrew language. So now the notion of a Jewish homeland was now a reality. Was a considerable Jewish enclave with Hebrew-speaking schools, almost like a quasi self-government. And Britain now wants wants to help them. Now, why would Britain be interested in helping the Jews of Palestine? Something that is one of the great miracles of history, that it really, we'll see the moment that later they want to take back. All that they gave us, they take it away. You will see by 1948 what a terrible, terrible disservice they do. They train the Arabs to destroy us. But at the beginning, the British want to help the Jews in Palestine. There are two reasons. Number one was the diplomatic effort of Herzl and people like Weizmann, who were in the circles of the British. And many British people actually, like we've seen in Lawrence Oliphant and Benjamin Disraeli and others, really had a sense that the Jewish people were the people of the land of Israel. And so in addition to this intellectual work that was existing, Britain also had another reason. They needed Jewish support for the war, support worldwide. So the dire need of a war, although there were only 85,000 Jews, maybe 100,000 Jews of a population of 600,000, nevertheless, they decide they are going to help to create a Jewish state, or at least what we call a Jewish homeland. Remember, by the way, in 1917, there were 600,000 Arabs in Israel. Pay attention to these numbers. But only a few years earlier, 1890, there were fewer than 250,000 Arabs. Why this great growth? It wasn't a natural growth. It was immigration that was coming to Israel because of the Jewish enterprise. The Arab labor was coming to man the citrus groves and all the industries that the Jews were creating by 1917. And of course, you have the famous book by Joan Peters, called From Time Immemorial, which I recommend to everyone. A woman who wrote a book. She originally interviewed Arab leaders, including Arafat. She came to write the story of the Arabs and to support the Arab cause. But when she started the history, she realized she was wrong, that the Arabs had come to the land of Israel as a result of Jewish enterprise. And that she documents Jews, Muslims coming from Europe, from Bosnia, from other places, from Iraq, to work in Israel. So they were not residents of Israel. They were not natives of Israel, of Palestine. So the British policy was now to support Zionism. And in 1917, the foreign minister of Israel, of England, a man who was a very good friend of Chaim Weizmann and very impressed with him, issues on behalf of the Majesty, the King, the famous declaration, Balfour Declaration. We'll discuss in a moment what that is. In one moment, we'll discuss in greater detail what the Balfour Declaration is. But so, alongside the work of the diplomats, you also have the work of the actual people who live in the land of Israel. But in addition to this, you have Jews who want to support Britain. One of the greatest Anglophiles in history, in our history, is none other than Zev Jabotinsky, who believed that we should support England, that England should support Zionist cause. And he's the one who creates the famous Zion Mule Corps and so on. it's interesting that at the same time, the Arabs were also helping, the English also were helping the Arabs, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, who creates with the Hashemite king of Jordan, it's called eventually Jordan, the Arab revolt. So they're a revolt against the Turks. So you have the Jews helping the British in the war, and the Arabs helping to overthrow the Ottoman Empire on behalf of the British. There's also a very important part which I want to narrate to you, a fascinating story. The Jews in Israel were supporting the British to invade Israel, Palestine. One of the famous stories is the story of Nili. Nili in Hebrew is Netzach Israel Lo Yishaker, the initials Nun Yud Lamed Yud, a Jewish spy network, which essentially was manned by a famous agronomist called Aaron Aronson. Aronson was discovered a weather-resistant primeval wheat. He was a very important agronomist, and he had a research station in Atlit. But that research station became essentially a spy agency for the British. Aaron's sister Sarah and Joseph Lishansky, one of the friends, giving information about Turkish troops in Palestine to the British. Allenby actually, the famous Allenby, who's going to be the general that invades Israel, relies on the Nili spies. Unfortunately, one of Nili carrier pigeons fell into the hands of the Turks in 1917, and they capture Sarah, and they want to kill her father. Sarah gives herself up. She's tortured, and eventually she kills herself. Others are hanged in Damascus. Aaron survived, and then he died in a plane crash in 1919. But it's interesting. You can go when you go to Israel, you'll see this story of Nili in the town of Zichron and Atlit. So I want to point out that while before the Ottoman Empire fell, there were a lot of diplomats in the world who wanted to support Turkey. And among them were none other than Americans. Henry Morgenthau, Felix Frankfurter, Jews were trying to, instead of defeat the Turks, they wanted to ameliorate the conditions for the Jews in Palestine. So there were two groups, one who wanted to help the British destroy the Ottoman Empire and create a state of Israel under the British sponsorship. And there was another group that was saying, let the Arabs, let's make peace with the Arabs, or the Turks rather, and create a sense of collaboration there. But Jabotinsky, again, a very pro-British politician, opposes these Jews and says, absolutely, we need to have a British support, to support the British. Weizmann is the perfect Jew, always perfectly, superbly tailored, a scientist who spoke with beautiful English, literary man. He made a very big impression on Balfour particularly, and he was very impressed by Weizmann. And Weizmann explained why the Jews needed to go back to the land of Israel. So Balfour is going to issue a declaration that the British supports the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This is a little bit different from creating a Jewish state. Jewish homeland means in Palestine. So originally, it should have been Palestine to be the national home of the Jews. But then some of the British people objected to that, saying that the whole Palestine is going to become the national home. So they said there would be a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That dilution of the Balfour Declaration was very significant. It was an important declaration, but it was less than what we had wanted. Sadly, one of the opponents of the stronger language was a Jew, the House of Lords, called Edwin Montagu, who feared the Muslims' reaction in India. So he didn't want to upset the Muslims in India by making this declaration, helping the Jews in Palestine. In November 1917, Allenby finally enters Palestine. Some beautiful pictures of him, how he's welcomed, received by the Jewish community in Jerusalem. Of course, the Arabs did not like it, but Allenby is supported by the Jews, and he enters around Hanukkah. It's interesting, the formal entry is exactly when, just like Yehuda Maccabee comes to inaugurate the Mizbech, the altar, so Allenby comes once again to cleanse the nation, the land, on behalf of the Jews. The Arabs, represented particularly by the Hashemites, particularly what we call, they were in today's Saudi Arabia, were friendly to the Zionists. But in Saudi Arabia, there is why is it called Saudi Arabia? Because the Hashemites, who were the protectors of the Mecca for generations, actually, they were the they were descendants of Muhammad. The house of Saud dislodges them, throws them out, it becomes Saudi Arabia. The Hashemites now have to move north, and the British have to give them some refuge. And so the Palestine, which was supposed to be from the Mediterranean all the way to Iraq, to the Euphrates, that's the whole Palestine. So the British now had said that in that area there's going to be the Jewish homeland. Now they said, well, we're going to have part of it, and we're going to give it to the Hashemites. And in 1922, Jordan, the country of Jordan, is created. Notice, by the way, how interesting that for the Jews, it took a long time, and they never created or supported a Jewish state. They created the idea of a Jewish homeland. But for the Arabs, immediately they created a state, and Jordan was created. This violence, the Arabs, before they get Jordan, as always, rioting. And by the way, it's interesting that rioting, violence, becomes very an effective form for the Arabs. The Arabs learn, if you riot, if you destroy, if you attack, people will do whatever you want. Sadly, it's a story that we now, in America particularly, are beginning to experience as well. The Arab rioters clash with the Jews. Jabotinsky and all the Jews get 15 years of jail for the disorder, the chaos. The Arabs get light sentences. This is the beginning of the favoritism by the British. But in 1920, a very important British diplomat, a Jew, Herbert Samuel, is appointed as the High Commissioner of Palestine. And he gives amnesty to all the Jews until the Arabs. Samuel, who was a devout Jew and a Zionist, helps the Jewish community. But the Hashemites, Faisal, looks at the appointment of a Jew as a High Commissioner for Palestine, which includes the Arabs and the Jews, as a Greek provocation. And the Arab becomes restive again. So one of the problems, the Arabs are saying there are too many Jews coming. They're taking over. So one of the decisions of Samuel, interesting, Herbert Samuel decides to say, well, we have to limit Jewish immigration. This is the beginning of a quota to appease the Arabs. And even Churchill issues a white paper, famous Churchill's white paper, that actually limits Jewish immigration to a certain number, so that it's not unlimited. The Palestine Mandate, which was to be by Britain from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, excludes Jewish homeland or east of the Jordan. 75% of the British mandate now goes to the Arabs. And the other 25% is going to be discussed and debated later on. A Jewish agency is created to manage the affairs of the Jews in Israel. And by 1921, there are only 87,000 Jews, 650,000 Muslims. Notice the great disparity. And this number is going to have eventually a great political repercussion. It's interesting to point out once again that the Arabs always failed. As Abba Eban said, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The British offered the Arabs to create an Arab agency to create and manage the affairs of the Arabs, as the Jews to create a Jewish agency to manage the affairs of the Jews. Eventually, they wanted to think of a possibility that they will work together as a confederation. But of course, the Arabs, in typical fashion, they refused to create an Arab agency. So there was nobody to talk to. The Jews, nonetheless, continue to maintain and manage the affairs of the Jews in Israel. But to reconcile the Zionist goal of bringing Jews and create a Jewish state in Palestine, it has it's a conflict with the Palestinians' Arab majority. And so Britain becomes aware that the task of reconciling these two ideas is going to be hopeless. On July 24, 1918, just to give you an idea of what was happening, a cornerstone is laid in Mount Scopus for the Hebrew University. Tel Aviv is growing rapidly, with 30,000 souls by 1918, only 9 or 10 years after it was created. In April 1925, the Hebrew University is inaugurated on the campus in Mount Scopus, with the presence of precisely Balfour himself. Balfour himself comes to that inauguration. And so my point here is that the Jews are creating a presence in Israel, almost a quasi self-government, and they're beginning to establish the institutions, universities, hospitals, the beginning of defense legions, an army, educational network, and of course, yeshivot, houses of study. So you have medical, social, intellectual, libraries. All of this is growing in Israel by 1920, 1921. We have a presence in Israel that, although small, is only less than 100,000 Jews, but that is really the beginning of a Jewish state. And I just want to point out how, in a very short period of time, partly as a result of the great political maneuvers and diplomacy that was going on in Europe, headed by Weizmann particularly, and the Zionist group, the Zionist Congress, that was pushing the nations to recognize the Jews as a state, as a nation, not just as a community. And the work in Israel itself, the colonies, the colonization, the growth, and we will see industry. The Jews are beginning to create cement factories, potash factories, of course, the citrus groves, and the creation of wine. These are things that are beginning to happen, and the Jews are beginning to grow and develop. But a great cloud hovers over them. 650,000 Arabs in Palestine hate the Jewish enterprise. It's something that the Jews could not conceive. They came to Israel as the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And many of them, like Herzl, actually thought that we're going to help the Arabs. It's not only for us. Herzl wanted to help the Arab economy. The socialists like Ben Gurion and others wanted to help the Arabs who are laboring, to have rights, to work against their bosses. They brought all these socialist ideas, not only for the Jews, but to help the Arabs as well. But the Arabs responded, as they always do, with a total negation. No, no, and no. And one of the forces of the Arabs, one of the political forces of the Arabs, was above all the riots. Whenever they did not like something, they went around destroying homes, killing people, making chaos. And the response of the British, instead of punishing them, was to appease them by limiting Jewish immigration, by giving them more rights, and essentially by coddling, until eventually there will be a major figure in the 1930s or the end of the 1920s, the Haj al-Husseini, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who's going to become the most odious and hateful Arab leader, who eventually is going to, as you recall, going to even be supporting of Hitler. There's a famous meeting of Hitler with al-Husseini to support the destruction of Jews in Israel. And so that, unfortunately, is the development that we're going to see. And I want to end with this thought. The Jewish dream of returning to the land of Israel was fueled and was strengthened by the concept of European governments like Britain and America supporting the idea of a Jewish state. But the British people realized quickly that they cannot do this because they're going to antagonize the Arabs. And so they have to play this game of helping the Jews on one hand and helping the Arabs on the other, and come into a conundrum. And they do not know how the whole thing is going to be resolved. And a series of papers essentially limiting the dream of the Balfour Declaration, these white papers that are going to say, limit the concept. And in fact, the British at some point say, what are we doing? We are rejecting our own declaration. These ideas are going to become the subject of the next decade, where the British, from the exuberance of supporting a Jewish homeland to the actually essentially repudiation of this concept and what happens in between, and the reaction of the Jews. This is the subject that we will be discussing, B'ezrat Hashem, in the next class.